My name is Paul Tibbets. In 1945, I was Colonel Paul Tibbets, and I commanded the 509th Composite Group, which was the Army Air Corps' first atomic bombardment unit. On the 6th of August in 1945, I flew the Enola Gay over the city of Hiroshima, Japan, dropping the first atomic bomb that was ever employed in warfare. There have been many questions that have been raised regarding that particular mission, the necessity for it, and what was accomplished. I can only say that one must look at this in the context of the thinking at the time of 1945, when the United States was in an all-out war against the Empire of Japan. At that particular time, August 1945, the United States was preparing to invade the Japanese homeland. Had that invasion taken place, many thousands of lives would have been lost, both by the Japanese and by the Americans making the invasion. The use of the atomic weapon was very carefully considered, and the decision was made to employ that weapon against the military target of Hiroshima, where the Japanese were assembling all of their forces to counter any invasion attempt by the United States. The Japanese, since that time, have entered into discussions with the Strategic Bombing Survey people. I have talked with many of them, and they believe that the decision to use that bomb was a correct one, because in their own words, they said that they would have used every effort at their disposal to resist an invasion by the invading forces. By their estimates and by those of the Strategic Bombing Survey, it is estimated that over 1 million lives would have been lost. As it was in both the cities of Hiroshima and when the second bomb was dropped on the city of Nagasaki, the estimates are that approximately 200 to 250,000 people perished as a result of those operations. We find today that people try to render moral judgments about the use of the weapon because of the devastating effect that took place once the bombs exploded. I think that one must not look at it from a moralistic point of view because of the fact that in a war there is no morality. We must look at it from the point of view of what the objective was, and the objective in this instance was to cause the Japanese to surrender to the terms that we proposed. Historically, we know now that is exactly what happened. And I do believe that as time passes in the future, that this decision to use this weapon, the effects and the results from its use will be substantiated by historians. Mr. Hubbard, I hope that the proceeding was basically what you want, and I remember in our telephone conversation you asked me to make any further comments that I might wish to make, which could be placed into the archives of the museum there. I do believe that there's a couple of things that might be touched upon because they are historically significant. The first that I'd like to comment upon is, of course, the the, 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 My memory fails me at the moment as to the exact date that took place, but I do believe that I'm not very far wrong in saying that it was in the early part of July of 1945. I was directed to fly from the United States out to the Marianas Island to do two things. Number one was to brief General Curtis C. LeMay, who commanded the 20th Air Force, as to what was going to happen. And number two, to acquaint Admiral Nimitz, the Pacific Theater commander, with what was going to happen, since it would be in his area of responsibility. I remember that Commander Ashworth, Dick Ashworth, later Vice Admiral Ashworth, he and I went to the headquarters of Admiral Nimitz on this particular morning and were duly ushered into the gentleman's office. We had the traditional cup of coffee, after which Commander Ashworth took up the conversation and explained what this 509th group was, and he explained the origin and the development of the atomic weapon to the Admiral. In a period of about 45 minutes in the Admiral's office, we acquainted him with what it was that we wanted to do, how we expected to go about it. He was most intent, most interested, and he indicated by instructions that he gave to his chief of staff that he wanted everything done that was necessary to support this unit to operate successfully. Well, needless to say, we had the utmost of support from both Admiral Nimitz headquarters and General Curtis LeMay's headquarters. Another thing that is often asked is, why did we select Hiroshima? Why did we select Nagasaki? In May of 1945, that early, there was a meeting in Washington which I attended, in which the targets within the Japanese Empire were looked at. The scientific element of the United States wanted to use targets that were as damage-free as it was possible to be, so that once these weapons were used, the effect of that weapon could be determined as far as damage was concerned to steel structures, concrete structures, all of the type of structures that one might expect within a city or industrial complex, and even waterfronts where shipping and whatnot might be located. At that particular time, based on the targets that had been selected by the 20th Air Force, Hiroshima, Nagasaki, Niigata, and Kokura were the only ones that could be stated to be damage-free and not to have been attacked. So those targets were immediately identified, and word was sent to the 20th Air Force without explanation as to the fact that they, the 20th Air Force, would not bomb those targets under any circumstances unless so permitted to by headquarters in Washington, D.C. Shortly after that, the meeting there in May, we had another meeting in which we had the long-range weather forecasters give us a prognosis as to the type of weather that we might expect in the month of August, the early month of August of that year. This was the time frame that the scientists back in the United States had come up with, saying that they thought they would have the weapon perfected and ready to use by that time. The forecast indicated that the first 2 weeks of August would give us visual bombing weather. Visual was desired and ordered, actually, by reason of the fact that radar in those days carried aboard an airplane was so primitive that the weapon's use with accuracy just couldn't be guaranteed. We had to use the Norden bomb sight, and it had to be a completely visual bomb drop. When the latter part of July and the 1st of August approached out there in the islands, we watched the prognosis that we had versus the weather forecasts that were being made and the maps that were being developed in the theater at that time. And it was almost unbelievable to us that the people in Washington had been able to predict as accurately as they had the weather that was going to exist over the empire at that time. Obviously, from the historical results, you know that we actually had the most clear weather that one could possibly hope for when we attacked Hiroshima. From an altitude of 33,000 feet, we could see the city almost 90 miles away. I say almost 90 miles because we had an initial point after coming in over the water that we had to fly over, and that was 90 miles from Hiroshima. And it was shortly after we crossed this initial point that my bombardier, Tom Farabee, said I had the city in sight. And for about 13 to 14 minutes, we sat in this airplane at about 33,000 feet, watching the city approach us, or I should say watching our approach to the city. Things became more and more clear. And actually, at about 4 minutes out, we had picked up the aiming point, and our mission from there on in was dramatically routine. I call it dramatically because actually nothing happened. We just sat there and waited. Everything just took place exactly like it had been planned. I've also been asked, what and why did we have to turn this airplane the way that we did? And obviously the answer to that one is that had we gone ahead after releasing the weapon, it was flying on the same trajectory as the course of the airplane, we would have been directly over it when it exploded. So it was necessary to do a very steep and dramatic type of a turn back towards the direction that we had been coming from in order to put the maximum distance between ourselves and the point of explosion. Now, when the bomb did explode, our back was to it, and we were aware of the explosion by reason of the brilliance of the flash. And another thing that I like to add, because I think it's rather unique, and that is I tasted the explosion. And I've been asked, well, why did you taste it? Back in those days, we had a lead compound filling that dentists put in our teeth. And when this bomb exploded, the radioactivity hit that lead in my teeth, and it gave me that particular taste. So I was aware that the thing had exploded, and I continued the turn of the airplane to come back and take a look at what damage had been done. Where we had seen the city in its entirety and without any obstruction, as we approached the release point, we were now unable to see anything but a black boiling mass down below us. I liken it to the old days of a barrel of tar being boiled prior to being poured on a street. It had this black bubbling underneath it, a cloud of steam on top, and then of course the traditional cloud associated with an atomic explosion went from there on up. The problem has been raised, was it necessary to use the second bomb on Nagasaki? I think historians have already proven that it was necessary. The Japanese thought that at that time that we had one weapon and one weapon only, and they figured that we had done all that we could. We had to show them that there was another weapon available. So then the release on Nagasaki was made. Contrary to some people's opinion, there was still a third bomb, and when immediately after Nagasaki the Japanese did not decide to surrender, I had an airplane sitting in Wendover, Utah with this bomb on board, and I ordered it to fly to Marianas Islands. We were going to use it. Target unknown at that particular time. But of course then, when the airplane actually 24 hours later was in San Francisco on its way to the Marianas Islands, the Japanese made their surrender. I believe that those are about the highlights that we discussed on the telephone, and I hope that this interview will be of some benefit to the Admiral Nimitz Museum.
It was a bright Virginia morning. Admiral Nimitz would have been pleased to be among old friends and shipmates. Even the President of the United States gathered to commission the world's largest warship, the USS Nimitz.
This great warship, built by Newport News Shipbuilding and Drive-Out Company, has components and parts furnished from every state of our Union. It is manned by sailors from every state of our Union. It is America's ship, and we think America should be as proud of her as we are to serve in her. With the help of the Lord, we will serve our country with dependability and honor. Nimitz bears the name of that distinguished naval officer, Fleet Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, who served our country so honorably and well. Admiral Nimitz's mark was professionalism, and we would aspire to emulate his example.
What a far cry from his first command, the destroyer Decatur, or the tiny submarines on which he saw duty before the First World War.
It's a deep personal honor for me to be here on this auspicious occasion, the commissioning ceremony of this magnificent carrier, Nimitz. And it's fitting that this most powerful warship in the world should bear the name Nimitz. For Admiral Nimitz was one of the greatest wartime leaders of the most powerful Navy the world has ever known. His character was the epitome of naval leadership, strong yet tolerant, quiet yet forceful, proud yet flexible. Foremost in Nimitz the man was his appreciation and abiding respect for the importance of his men.
The commissioning ceremony continued with the Honorable J. William Middendorf II.
33 years ago today, on the 3rd of May, 1942, the United States aircraft carriers, the Yorktown and the Lexington, under orders from Admiral Nimitz, were steaming at flank speed into the Coral Sea, and the ensuing battle of the Coral Sea was the first battle fought between the United States and the Japanese aircraft carriers, and the first naval action in which the opposing fleets remained out of sight of each other. Today, we honor one of the architects of the U.S. naval victories during World War II, Rear Admiral Chester Nimitz.
Fleet Admiral Nimitz was a man of vision who could look ahead to the needs of the future. As Chief of Naval Operations, he directed Admiral Rickover and his associates to move full speed ahead in developing nuclear energy to power ships. And before his death in 1966, Admiral Nimitz saw this as a reality when he sailed on the submarine Nautilus, the first nuclear-powered submarine. On this morning in May 1975, there was a feeling that from somewhere, Admiral Nimitz was smiling down on the crowd gathered to hear President Gerald Ford dedicate the proud ship bearing his name.
Professor E.B. Potter of the Naval Academy summed up Admiral Nimitz's qualities in simple words that well served as a model for anyone who aspires to leadership in any line of endeavor. And I quote from Professor Potter, "He surrounded himself with the ablest men he could find and sought their advice, but he made his own decisions. He was a keen strategist who never forgot that he was dealing with human beings on both sides of the conflict. He was aggressive in war without hate, audacious while never failing to weigh the risk. Admiral Nimitz, of all the great American commanders of World War II, was one of the most self-effacing and certainly one of the most effective. He possessed great stamina, an abundance of common sense, and such immense inner strength that he felt no need to strut or to shout. Born near what today we would call the poverty level, he worked hard, he studied hard, and was a long, long time getting ahead. He spent his whole life training to serve his country in commanding men at sea. And when he was needed, he was prepared. He learned by his mistakes and was tolerant of others. But he was always in command. Those who had the good fortune to know Admiral Nimitz will say his fundamental honesty, intellectual honesty and integrity enabled him to keep a steady course toward his ultimate objective. His own philosophy, in his own words, has long been a personal inspiration to me. Typically, he credited to his seafaring grandfather. The sea, like life itself, is a stern taskmaster, he recalled. The best way to get along with either is to learn all you can, then do your best, and don't worry, especially about things over which you have no control. So this great ship is a symbol of a great sea commander and a great American. Good afternoon, and Godspeed.
The date, April 1942. 4 months after Pearl Harbor, the U.S. Navy strikes back with a daring daylight raid on the Japanese capital. In the 4 months after Pearl Harbor, the Japanese advanced all across the Pacific, taking strategic positions just north of Australia and in the islands closest to Hawaii. Admiral Nimitz started to gather intelligence about the Japanese forces in the Great Pacific. The home front was disheartened when the Philippine garrison under General Wainwright surrendered. But a combined Navy, Army, Air Corps maneuver was planned to let the Japanese know they'd picked on a nation capable of action. Despite some friction between the American branches of service, Air Corps bombers were loaded aboard the carrier Hornet.
I think the cooperation was excellent. There seemed to be, at first, a little question in the minds of some of the Navy people what Army Air Force people were doing on a carrier. However, as soon as we were at sea, all hands were called on deck and were told what the mission was to be. From then on, there was complete rapport. An indication of how complete that rapport was by the fact that Captain Missner gave me his quarters in which to stay, and all of the other folks were treated equally well.
The crews of the 16 Mitchell medium bombers had the imperial capital fixed in their minds as the target. Admiral Bill Halsey hoped to get within 400 miles of Tokyo, but a Japanese picket boat detected the fleet's approach. So, 600 miles out, on the morning of April 16, 1942, Halsey sent in Doolittle and his flyers. The bombers were heavy with extra fuel and bombs. Slowly, they lumbered off the short flight deck. Each of the planes had a specific target, the power stations and military factories of Tokyo, Kobe, and Nagoya. By noon, most of the planes had sighted their objectives. But the argument over actual damage done has never been settled.
From the point of view of destruction, it was phenomenal. However, it gave the American people the first good news they had had. It caused the Japanese to question their warlords who had promised that Japan would never be attacked from the air. It also caused the diversion of aircraft to the defense of the home island, which we had no intention of getting again in the immediate future, away from the South Pacific where the battle was going on.
Raiders were expected to find their way beyond Japan to friendly China, where the Soochow airfield awaited them. None of the Doolittle planes was lost over Japan, but all but one of them crashed in the China Sea and over mainland China, out of fuel. The other plane landed at Vladivostok, where the Russians interned the crew. Yet 71 of the 80 airmen who took off from the deck of the Hornet lived to tell about the great Tokyo raid, the first victory under Admiral Nimitz' command in the Pacific. Turning point in the War of the Pacific, an all-out attack that sank 4 Japanese aircraft carriers and broke the back of the Japanese fleet off Midway Island. One man saw it all. Ensign George Gay was the only survivor of Torpedo Squadron 8 from the carrier Hornet, but he lived to tell the Admiral about the victory.
The thing started on June the 3rd, and on the morning of June the 4th, our plan was to wait until they had made their initial attack and then try to catch them when the aircraft were coming back short of ammunition and fuel and everything, so we'd have an advantage. Well, our air groups all took off. Our squadron was a little late because some of our airplanes were on the hangar deck and they were going to altitude. We couldn't go with them. So we were alone. Our commanding officer had tried to convince the group commander and the skipper of the ship that the Japs would be north and west of where everybody was going to go, down toward the island of Midway. So they went toward the island of Midway, and we went right straight to the Japs. We got into our attack formation and blew right on in. At the time, I figured we were outnumbered about 3 to 1. We had 15 airplanes, 2 men in each airplane. It turns out I learned after the war that the Japanese combat patrol consisted of some 75 airplanes, and they all came down after us. The group that I was with, Torpedo Squadron 8, on our way in, when the Zeros got onto us, they annihilated us. They shot down everyone. My airplane was the only one that got into the fleet close enough to actually drop a torpedo. I went out on the other side, and then the Zero shot me down. My gunner was killed. I tried to help him after the airplane went into the water. As the airplane was sinking, I went back to try and help him get out, but he was dead, Bob Huntington. And as I came to the surface, the Zero strafed me for a little while, but the point of the thing is that I was then right in the middle of the Jap fleet. Our dive bombers annihilated their aircraft carriers, and their airplanes were going in the water. They were going around picking up their pilots. Well, I didn't want to be picked up by the Japanese, so I was hiding under a leather cushion that had come out of my airplane. So I was trying to hide from them, but I stayed there all afternoon, and all night I watched them bomb these ships and watched them blow up, and that night I watched the Japanese sink one of their carriers to keep us from getting it, and I saw the whole thing.
Torpedo Squadron 8's sacrifice was not in vain. The 30 heroes drew the fire of Japanese fighters and allowed American dive bombers to catch the Japanese carriers unprotected. But Ensign Gay's story does not stop there. He had had an incredible adventure, a front row seat at an historic naval battle.
The next morning, PBY patrol plane came by. I spotted him, and I showed him the direction he was going. I knew that he was out looking for the Japanese, so I showed him which way to go. That afternoon, he came back and picked me up and flew me in to the island of Midway. I had lost 28 pounds in the water there, so the next morning, I was flown down to Pearl Harbor to hospital facilities. I had a bullet wound in my hand and in my arm, and I had some shrapnel in my back and a burn leg and a few things, so I had to have some medical attention. I'm in the bed there in the hospital, and they opened the doors out onto this lanai, and about 35 very senior officers come in, led by Fleet Admiral Chester W. Nimitz. So he came over to me and he said, "How do you feel?" And I said, "Well, sir, I've lost some weight and I've had some problems, but I'm getting the best care that there can be, and under the circumstances, I feel all right." He said, "Have you notified your family that you're all right?" And I said, "No, sir. I figured I was in a war zone and didn't even know I could send messages to the States." And he kind of chuckled and he said, "Well, maybe you can't, but I can." So I dictated my message to my parents, and the Admiral then turned to me and he said, "I have been in command of this whole situation since the beginning, and as you know, we had broken the code and we had some anticipation of this, but our fleet has been and is under complete radio silence, and I don't know one thing about what's been going on out there. I understand that you do, that you've seen it. Would you mind telling us about it?" Well, I said, "Of course not, sir. That's part of what I'm trained for, and if it'll do any good, I'll tell you everything I know." And I proceeded then to tell everything that I had seen. Well, it didn't sink in on me then, and maybe it still hasn't, that the biggest naval battle in history, the commanding officer on the United States side didn't know anything about it, and I'm in a position to bring him the information. If you're interested in any of the details of this story, it's all in the book somewhere, but I wanted to tell you what a wonderful man that I think, well, that I know that Admiral Nimitz was.
Admiral Nimitz had one great admirer among the Japanese warriors in the Pacific. That was Admiral Yamamoto, the Japanese commander of the combined fleet. Although Yamamoto had originally opposed war with the United States, he was an able strategist and an honorable man. Navy cryptographers cracked the Japanese code, however, and American Air Corps fighters from Guadalcanal caught Yamamoto in the open sky one day in April 1943. Kage Yanagiya flew a Zero to escort Yamamoto from Rabaul to Bougainville, April 18, 1943. He lived to tell what he saw that day, as well as American fighter pilot Rex Barber, who was based on Guadalcanal.
He was down there for an inspection tour and to bolster up the sagging morale of his troops. There were supposed to be 40 or 50 escort fighters come up to give him an escort of honor in to the landing strip. But for some reason, those fighters were late, and they were up, thank God.
It was dangerous for the Americans to be flying over Bougainville because they could be sighted by lookouts, and then radio messages could be sent to all military units alerting the Japanese forces and advising them of the speed and course and altitude of the American aircraft. Yanagiya later learned that the P-38s had made a detour to approach Buin from an altitude of only 1,500 meters or 4,500 feet in order to avoid detection. They were successful in this maneuver, and the surprise was total.
There they were, 6 Zeros and 2 bombers, which we expected, as Mitch said, only one. Well, Mitch says, go get them, Tom. So Tom's flight, which I was on his wing, and Hine and Holmes, which was his second element, headed in. Mitch then climbed per plan to take care of these fighters that were supposedly coming from Kahili. But Tom and I bored on in, and as we approached the bombers, we came in from right angles. The bombers were coming down like this, and they were heading down. They were diving at a fairly steep angle after they had sighted us.
The American aircraft came to attack from over the ocean. In other words, the bomber carrying Admiral Yamamoto was flying where Yanagiya is now pointing with his pencil, and the bomber carrying the Chief of Staff was to the left. The three fighters were positioned so as to protect Admiral Yamamoto from an attack that might originate over the ocean. The lead plane of the 2nd Fighter Escort Group was piloted by Chief Officer Okazaki. He sighted the P-38s first, and he made a sudden turn and broke away from the formation and dived rapidly earthward.
And as we were closing in, we could see that those Zeros were going to get between us and the bombers. So Tom whipped up into the Zeros, and he ran, he went up toward the Zeros. I continued on in. I got in pretty close, and I banked like this. And when I banked up like this, I blanked out of the two bombers blanked out from my wings. So then I rolled back again, and here was one bomber. The other bomber had disappeared. I don't know where it went. And we were down then probably 400 or 500 feet off the trees. I came right in behind the bomber.
Yanagiya was quite sure that the Americans sighted the Japanese before the Japanese sighted the Americans. This was because the P-38s were flying at low altitude, and it was easy for them to look up and see the Japanese formation silhouetted against the sky. From the Japanese vantage point, however, it was difficult to spot the P-38s because they were camouflaged so as to blend with the color of the jungle over which they were flying. Therefore, the P-38s were ready to commence the attack when they were first sighted. The P-38s concentrated their firepower on the bomber containing Admiral Yamamoto. Yanagiya is quite sure that they must have known that Admiral Yamamoto was riding in that particular aircraft.
I got right in behind him and I started shooting. And I shot in the right engine, I pulled through, shot the left engine, then I pulled back through the center of the bomber again. A piece of the vertical fin flew off. I don't know whether it was a part of his rudder or just off, but something flew off about that time. And as I got back through the center of the airplane, he did a quick snap. Now, for a big bomber like that to do a snap is something, but it snapped over, and I went over the top of him just like that.
Admiral Yamamoto's aircraft began to leak gasoline. This was followed by a stream of black smoke, and soon flames enveloped the lead bomber, and it fell into the jungle where it continued to burn. Yanagiya says that he saw the attack and the actual shooting, and he was quite sure at the time that no one could have escaped alive. Yanagiya is repeating once again that he was quite sure that the sole objective of the American attack was to shoot down the plane carrying the Commander-in-Chief, Admiral Yamamoto.
Main thing was, and I think that you and I both agree on this, the main thing is we got Yamamoto. That's right. And that's what was up there for, and that was the important part of it. And other people have their versions of it. That's their business. But you and I know we got him. That's right.
The date, 1945. Victory in Europe, but a costly and painful war in the Pacific continues against increasingly fierce resistance. A difficult decision is made, one that will end the war in the Pacific, quickly and finally. In 1945, it was Colonel Paul Tibbets who flew the Enola Gay over Hiroshima. His mission began at Tinian in the Marianas Islands. Only the day before was his crew told of the true power of the weapon they would carry.
I can only say that one must look at this in the context of the thinking at the time of 1945 when the United States was in an all-out war against the Empire of Japan. At that particular time, August 1945, the United States was preparing to invade the Japanese homeland. Had that invasion taken place, many thousands of lives would have been lost, both by the Japanese and by the Americans making the invasion. The use of the atomic weapon was very carefully considered, and the decision was made to employ that weapon against the military target of Hiroshima, where the Japanese were assembling all of their forces to counter any invasion attempt by the United States. It is estimated that over 1 million lives would have been lost.
At 2:45 on the morning of August 6th, 1945, Colonel Tibbets rolled his bomber down the runway, beginning the 6.5-hour flight to Japan. Over Iwo Jima, Tibbets began a slow climb for altitude. At 8:15, a weather plane reported from Hiroshima. The weapon was checked out one last time.
An altitude of 33,000 feet, we could see the city almost 90 miles away. I say almost 90 miles because we had an initial point after coming in over the water that we had to fly over, and that was 90 miles from Hiroshima. And it was shortly after we crossed this initial point that my bombardier, Tom Farby, said I had the city in sight. And for about 13 to 14 minutes, we sat in this airplane at about 33,000 feet, watching the city approach us, or I should say watching our approach to the city. Things became more and more clear. And actually, at about 4 minutes out, we had picked up the aiming point, and our mission from there on in was dramatically routine. I call it dramatically because actually nothing happened. We just sat there and waited. Everything just took place exactly like it had been planned.
At 9:11, the Enola Gay began its bomb run. At 9:15, the bomb was dropped and the plane banked away at high speed.
Had we gone ahead after releasing the weapon, it had was flying on the same trajectory as the course of the airplane, we would have been directly over it when it exploded. So it was necessary to do a very steep and dramatic type of a turn back towards the direction that we had been coming from in order to put the maximum distance between ourselves and the point of explosion. Now, when the bomb did explode, our back was to it.
Just 50 seconds after release of the bomb, only 15 miles from ground zero, the Enola Gay was rocked by the blast.
We were aware of the explosion by reason of the brilliance of the flash, and another thing that I like to add, because I think it's rather unique, and that is I tasted the explosion. And I've been asked, well, why did you taste it? Back in those days, we had a lead compound filling that dentists put in our teeth. And when this bomb exploded, the radioactivity hit that lead in my teeth, and it gave me that particular taste. So I was aware that the thing had exploded, and I continued the turn of the airplane to come back and take a look at what damage had been done. Where we had seen the city in its entirety and without any obstruction as we approached the release point, we were now unable to see anything but a black boiling mass down below us. I liken it to the early days of a barrel of tar being boiled prior to being poured on the street. It had this black bubbling underneath it, a cloud of steam on top, and then of course the traditional cloud associated with an atomic explosion went from there on up.
4 days later, a second bomb was dropped on Nagasaki, but Tibbets relates that there was indeed yet another bomb ready.
There was still a third bomb, and when immediately after Nagasaki the Japanese did not decide to surrender, I had an airplane sitting in Wendover, Utah with this bomb on board, and I ordered it to fly to Marianas Islands. We were going to use it. Target unknown at that particular time. But of course then, when the airplane actually 24 hours later was in San Francisco on its way to the Marianas Islands, the Japanese made their surrender.
Thus did the war in the Pacific end, and the atomic age in warfare begin.
island of New Guinea above Australia. On the day before Christmas in 1942, this American M3 Stuart tank, commanded by Australian Sergeant Jack Lattimore, was moving down an old airstrip. This Japanese 3-inch gun behind you, which had caused so much trouble, supposedly had been knocked out. But suddenly, as Sergeant Lattimore swung his turret to the left, he saw a sister tank go down. Then his own tank was hit. He tells us what happened.
And as I turned right, I saw the flash of the gun. There was a frightful impact. The tank just jarred to a halt. The impact was so great that I was unaware of any real noise. It's impossible to describe just how the impact was. Everything just stopped. As a matter of fact, my watch stopped and the time was 11:27. As I looked around, I realized that we had been very badly damaged. I looked down and there was a gaping hole in the hull gunner's position with Corporal Foster, my hull gunner, obviously dead, smashed back over his seat. And then I saw my driver glance around, clamber out of his seat, shoot out through the hole in which the shell came. All I saw was a pair of feet disappearing. And then I stepped down into the turret, from the top of the turret into the body of the tank, and discovered that both my legs had been very badly smashed. Somehow or other I got into the tunnel box, lifted my gunner off the gun where he was leaning, moaning, and somehow or other with the help of the wireless operator, I pushed him out through the hole. The next problem, of course, was the wireless operator. I got him out through the hole. He also was hit badly in the knees and had completely lost control of his legs. Then the problem came was how was I to get out? So I worked out that I must crawl along on my hands and go out over the dead man through the hole and out. This I proceeded to do. At this time the tank was well and truly alight with something like 150 gallons of high-octane fuel burning. The ammunition was starting to go off in the guns, in the boxes, and it was really merry hell.
To counter Japanese artillery, the Australians brought in a 25-pound weapon nicknamed Carson's gun, fresh from battles on the African deserts. Major William Hall, traveling with the gun, tells of the ordeal in getting to the battle site.
And it was the most difficult task that they'd been given because the nature of the country was such that it was swampy, the climate was terrible, it was hot, incessant rain, malaria, dysentery, leeches, skin diseases were all rampant. And the job of beating the Japs, who were already settled in and had their defensive position strongly prepared, was not easy at all, as had been thought by the commanders. And therefore the battle generally developed. This gun was sighted in an abandoned Japanese bunker, put in at night, without the knowledge of the Japanese. It's great trauma to us because we had to cross a couple of creeks, small rivers, and there were no bridges over them strong enough to take the gun. The gun was too heavy. It was strong enough to take a jeep, but not the gun. And so to get this gun through, we had to dismantle the breech mechanism and pull the gun underwater from one side to the other. It actually went under 10 feet of water. We got the jeep over the other side to help the men to pull it across. Then it was reassembled and we put it into this Japanese bunker.
Sergeant Bing Carson and his men placed their gun in an old Japanese trench, concealed by camouflage. Using a former Japanese observation post high in a banyan tree, Carson's skilled gun crew fired with such accuracy that they wiped out everything opposing them. The 3-barreled machine cannon and 3-inch guns, including the one behind you which hit Lattimore's tank. Captain Tom Hendren Smith, who was in that observation post, tells his story.
So Carson's gun was installed in a vacant Japanese bunker at the end of the airstrip at night. It was sighted to demolish the main Japanese defenses at ranges from 900 to 1,600 yards. At these ranges, the trajectory of the 25-pounder shell is very flat, and by using fuses with a slight delayed action, it was possible to penetrate the surface of the targets and cause the shell to explode inside the bunkers with devastating effect. Because of the close proximity of our infantry to the target area, in some cases less than 50 yards, the gun laying had to be meticulously accurate. The OP provided a clear view of the Japanese positions, the closest being about 200 yards across the strip, and the main bunkers were about 400 yards away. I am pleased to say that we systematically flattened every bunker in the target area in the ensuing 6 days. The centerpiece of the bunker system contained a triple-barreled 25mm anti-aircraft pom-pom, which was a murderous weapon against infantry. Carson's gun engaged this weapon in a duel which lasted several days before it was completely destroyed. And more than anything, it was the destruction of this gun which raised the morale of the attacking Australian and American infantry.
The Japanese never found Carson's gun, and with joking requests from the infantry to Sergeant Carson to quit rustling the grass over their heads with his shells, Carson's gun went on to help win the battle at Buna. Jim Taylor, last survivor of Carson's crew, tells of the victory.
By New Year 1943, or a few days after that, the whole of 55 Battery were able to move up to the other end of the Buna strip. And Carson's gun, of course, joined up again with their colleagues from their own troop and from Eddy troop. It was from here we brought fire down to assist the Americans to take Buna village itself. It was from here that we were able to bring fire down again to assist in the final victory of Sanananda, which was the last of the battles of those beaches, the last of the Japanese that had come over the Kokoda Trail. This was the last time that Carson's gun crew saw that 25-pounder. Although we saw action in a number of other places afterwards, in other parts of the world, we never believed we ever had a gun as good as that gun, as accurate or as reliable. It was here, of course, that we finally returned, and I suppose that every one of us, the one hope we had was that we'd done something to make it easier for the hard-pressed infantry, that we'd done something to further the victory in the Pacific area in 1942-43.
Brigadier Sir William Hall.
Buna was the most important one because the Japs were in great strength there, and but for the American Navy's glorious victory in the Coral Sea Battle in May of '42, they would have been very strongly reinforced. And so Buna and the Coral Sea Battle are very closely related. Most Australians, and very few Americans, I take it, realize the importance of this battle, and of the Coral Sea Battle, in fact, because had the Americans not annihilated the Japanese in the Coral Sea Battle, and had the joint American-Australian forces not beaten them at Buna, then Australia would have surely seen war in our own country and in our own cities. We were saved by these two very, very great battles.
Combat Information Center from a World War II destroyer. We're going to use it to recreate for you the most nearly perfect destroyer battle in the Pacific War, the Battle of Cape St. George. It was the day before Thanksgiving, 1943.
Commodore Arleigh Burke's squadron of 5 destroyers, Charles Osborne, Claxton, Dyson, Converse, and Spence, was topping off their fuel tanks in Hawthorne Sound near Bougainville in the South Pacific when Admiral Halsey's message reached them. 31 Knot Burke, get this. Put your squadron athwart the Buca-Rabaul evacuation line. If enemy contacted, you know what to do.
This cryptic message set the stage for a fast chase and a high-speed battle called the most nearly perfect destroyer action in the Pacific War, the Battle of Cape St. George.
Now hear this. Station the Special Sea Detail. Single up all lines, make preparation to get underway in 5 minutes.
But let's hear it from Admiral Burke, whose famous nickname, 31 Knot Burke, came from that message.
The night was dark with no moon, but a lot of rain squalls. The sea was gently rolling, and I thought to myself, what a perfect night for a torpedo attack. Naval intelligence suspected the Japanese Amakusaka was going to use his destroyers to evacuate his aviation personnel from Buka in the Lower Solomon Islands across to his naval base at Rabaul. And Admiral Halsey wanted us to intercept them. So we moved out fast. And after hours of fast steaming, we neared the area where we might intercept the enemy. And I ordered our ships to slow from 30 knots to lessen the chance of our wakes being spotted from the air.
Hello, Bolt. This is Derby. Stand by to execute. Down 5.
At 49 minutes past midnight, air search radar reported.
Bogey, bearing 250, 30 miles.
Was this aircraft ours, or had the Japanese found us? 6 minutes later.
Bogey, bearing 225, 20 miles.
CIC from radio. Shift aircraft warning net frequency to 3,000.
Then.
Bogey is friendly. We read his IFF.
Gun crews breathed again. The destroyers sliced through the black night. Binoculars of lookouts and duty officers on the bridge peered anxiously into the darkness, while radar operators scanned their instruments in crowded combat information centers, much like the one that you're in. Suddenly, the destroyer Dyson broke radio silence.
Derby from Pablo. We have an SG radar contact bearing 085, 22,000 yards.
Then Spence.
Derby, this is Dragon. We have 2 Apple gadgets at 075, distance 22,000.
Then Claxton.
We have course 280, 20 knots for Apple gadget.
These were Japanese destroyers. Commodore Burke's warning was the punchline from an old sea story, understood by all.
Hello, Bolt. This is Derby. Hang on to your hats, boys. Here we go again.
Then, to turn the destroyers toward the targets.
Bolt from Derby. Prepare for action to port. Division Corpin 085. Nash, hold back until you get your proper bearing. That is 225. Acknowledge. Now hear this. All hands, man your battle stations. All hands, man your battle stations. This is no drill.
Exhausted sailors sprang to life at the spine-tingling command. Thus began a night of action which the president of the Naval War College called the almost perfect destroyer battle. 3 Japanese destroyers sunk without a single hit on American ships. Combat information centers like this one were the hearts and brain centers of the incredible battle.
The Japanese radar was apparently inferior to ours, and there was no indication that Commodore Kagawa realized that we were on a collision course with him and about to launch torpedoes at him. We thought the Japanese might have some cruisers in the area, so on the way into the attack, we broke radio silence to send our first contact report to Admiral Halsey. We didn't know what the outcome of this battle was going to be, and it was possible that if we didn't send a report before the battle started, we might never get it off.
ComSoPac from ComDesron 2-3. Enemy vessels, strength unknown. I am attacking. This is my first report. Time 0145 Love. Derby.
Torpedo control from CIC. Enemy course 290, speed 25 knots.
After minutes that seemed like hours, our 3 lead destroyers neared the torpedo firing point, 50 degrees on the enemy's port bow for a run of 4,500 yards.
Burbank, this is Derby. We will fire torpedoes on his port bow. Prepare to fire half salvos.
Then the coded command to launch torpedoes.
Burbank, this is Derby. Stand by to execute William. Execute William.
Torpedoes away.
Derby from Pablo. Our guppies are swimming.
15 torpedoes raced toward the unsuspecting Japanese destroyers.
Burbank, stand by to execute turn 9. Execute turn 9. 190 is the new course. Increase speed to 30 knots.
Sunset, Roger, out.
This is Pablo. Roger, out.
Our right turn and increase in speed was a maneuver calculated to avoid enemy torpedoes, which we were pretty sure the Japanese would fire just as soon as they saw the flashes of our own tubes as we launched torpedoes. We could see our own flashes all up and down the line, but apparently the Japanese did not, because they steamed on in a nice straight course at a constant speed without firing either guns or torpedoes. And 4.5 minutes later, there were 3 tremendous explosions as our torpedoes hit. The Japanese were taken by complete surprise. We must have hit the magazines of the lead destroyer, the Onami, because it went down at once. We could see it disintegrate. Orange fire and debris went hundreds of feet high, and we stood out like sore thumbs, but not nearly as much as a second Japanese ship, Mikinami, which also exploded and broke in 2.
God almighty, you should see this. We hit 2 of them and the fire is 1,000 feet in the air. It's bright as day up here on the bridge.
CIC, aye. Keep giving us the word.
Immediately after firing and turning, we picked up an additional contact on the radar to the east. We didn't know that the Japanese were divided into 2 groups about 13,000 yards apart. And as soon as the first Japanese ships went up in flames, the second group headed north and away, with our ships in hot pursuit. We thought we were pretty good at this speed business, but they were very good too. As they turned north, we pulled on everything we had, turning up about 31 knots, which meant 33 knots for the last ship in column.
Delta from Sunset, how many turns are you making?
Sunset, Delta, we indicate 382. That's about 20 RPMs over full power, so I don't know how long we can keep it up.
Burbank from Derby. They're pulling away. They must be making at least 35 knots. Burbank from Derby. Take station left echelon. We can't catch these SOBs, so we'll use gunfire as soon as you are open. Sunset and Pablo, report when you are on echelon so we can open fire.
About this time, the Japanese opened up on us with gunfire, and we started zigzagging so we wouldn't give them a setup. If they had changed course and come across our bow and crossed our T, they could fire torpedoes down our throats and be sure to get hits. Fortunately, they did not.
Hey, Bridge, what's going on up there? Are they shooting back? That sounded close.
They sure as hell are. There's through water all over us. You guys got any room left down there?
After we had been chasing those Japanese for 15 or 20 minutes, I had an uneasy feeling
that if the Japanese were ever going to fire torpedoes at us, it would be very soon. So on a hunch, I changed course to the right.
Hello, Burbank. Stand by to execute turn 3. Execute turn 3.
A minute or so later, we heard some terrific explosions on our port beam, and I looked to see if we still had a bow. Then I looked to see which of our other ships might have been hit. But it turned out that these were torpedoes fired by the Ugiri, detonating in our wakes where we had just been a few minutes before. In a running fight, the pursuer needs a lot more speed than the pursued, so he can weave and bring his broadsides to bear. When we realized that we weren't going to get within torpedo range of the Japanese, we opened up with our 5-inch 38 caliber guns, firing directly ahead. This created some real problems with smoke and fire and gas, and worse, some broken eardrums on the number 1 gun crews, since the number 2 guns were firing directly above their heads. We could see hits on the enemy ships every now and then as they zigzagged.
Hey, Bridge, are we hitting anything? Yeah, looks like we're doing pretty good. There's a lot of smoke and we're blind from the flashes up here.
We sent another report to Admiral Halsey.
Comsopac from Comdesron 2-3. The gun battle continues. The enemy is scattered. Some may get away. They're tough to sink.
All of our guns were concentrated on the largest Japanese destroyer, the Ugiri. We could see projectiles go into her hull, and soon we saw several large explosions, and she started circling, gradually heeling over to starboard. But she still wouldn't go down, so we ordered the Dyson to fire torpedoes into her.
Admiral from Derby, put 5 fish in that damn thing. She won't sink any other way. Wilco, Derby. This is Pablo.
Dyson is probably the only ship in history to fire torpedoes over a target, because the Japanese ship sank before the torpedoes reached her. About this time, the night fighter that had been covering us called.
Derby, this is Red Wing 7. We're over a ship that's dead in the water, on fire and exploding. About 30 miles north of you, we've dropped a flare. We shall continue to circle, over.
Red Wing 7 from Derby. Continue to orbit while we try to raise a Baker 24 to finish the job. Derby out.
The ship had been running all night, and although the high-speed chase continued, the pressure eased off a little, and there was even some kidding among the ship captains as to how far the chase should go. Well, daylight wasn't far away, nor were the Japanese planes at Rabaul.
Say, Delta, this is Dragon. We've been running on 3 boilers and we're getting pretty low on feed water. Guess I have to put beer in my boilers. Dragon from Delta. The skipper says save that beer. We'll need it later on.
Sunset from Pablo. Maybe we can take on fuel at Rabaul. Do you think the Japanese hose connections will fit?
Delta, this is Acme. We're as low on ammo as you are on oil. Has the skipper assigned anchorage at Rabaul yet?
As daylight approached, we began worrying about the fighter plane cover that we knew Admiral Halsey would send to us if he could. The P-38s were the only planes that could reach us from Munda, which is up by Guadalcanal, and have any gasoline left at all. And we hoped that that flight had not been canceled. We suddenly realized also what day it was. And so we sent another message to Admiral Halsey.
Comsopac from Comdesron 2-3. On this Thanksgiving Day, we are to be grateful to Comair Sols for air cover. We have come to course 150, 31 knots our maximum speed. Low on ammunition and torpedoes. Have enough fuel but low on water.
Our night fighter called again.
Derby, this is Red Wing 7. My fuel is getting low. Request permission to head for home. Red Wing 7 from Derby. Permission granted. Many thanks. Out.
Daylight came. Still no enemy planes. Everyone was on edge.
Derby, this is Dragon. We have a group of friendly planes closing on 112. Distance, 32 miles.
Every minute brought us closer to safety. It was unbelievable. And then our P-38s appeared, 16 of them. And never has a white star on a wing meant so much to tired sailors as on those lightnings.
Derby, this is Wundeleader. Wundeleader. We're here to lead you back home. Are you ready to go?
Wundeleader from Derby. Boy, are we glad to see you. Lead the way.
We were tired, and we were also very grateful. The plane swooped down on us and gave us a salute and covered us like a house of fire as we headed for home. Like our battles, the Battle of Cape St. George taught us something. That fortune of war is a fickle wench, and that results hang by narrow threads. Many things could have prevented this battle from being fought at all. The time for reaching the interception point was chosen at random, and a few minutes' delay anywhere along the line could have prevented the battle from being fought. Especially, it taught us about good luck, as well as powers beyond our own. By the law of averages, some of us should have been hit. There were a lot of bullets flying around, and many torpedoes were fired, but not one of our own people was even wounded. The feeling of fraternalism under such conditions is a joyous experience. The captains had trained their ships well, and their ships exemplified the spirit of their captains. It was an outstanding performance. It was Thanksgiving Day, and we were very thankful. So thankful that our skippers asked if we might hold church services as soon as we returned to port. I felt the same way, and so we did. Our squadron was proud of its accomplishments, but humbly aware that those accomplishments were made possible by a force beyond our control. The Navy stresses a thing called devotion to duty. It also stresses aggressiveness, boldness, courage, and determination. These are fine words, but they don't mean much until you see them in battle, as we saw them all that night off Cape St. George.